The winter of 1944 pressed hard against Luxembourg City, but the chill inside Allied headquarters had nothing to do with the weather. It was December 20th, and the telephone lines crackled with tension as General Omar Bradley stood in silence, gripping the receiver as if he could strangle the voice on the other end. Dwight Eisenhower had made his decision. 2 American armies would now fall under British command, under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. To the men who had fought across Africa, Sicily and France, the order felt like betrayal wrapped in protocol. The Americans had bled their way from the deserts of Tunisia to the hedgerows of Normandy, yet now their hard-won command was being handed to the man many of them trusted least. That single moment revealed how deeply personal the Allied war had become, not just a struggle against Hitler's Germany, but against ego, pride, and the impossible chemistry of partnership. To understand why the name Montgomery could ignite such fury, one had to go back to the beginning, to North Africa, 1943, where the legend and the resentment were born. The sun burned the Tunisian horizon when George S. Patton first set foot in the sand, summoned to rebuild a broken American corps after its humiliation at Kasserine Pass. The defeat had been brutal. American soldiers routed by battle-hardened German armour, command fractured, morale shattered. The British watched with polite disapproval, their confidence laced with quiet contempt. Reports from their senior officers painted Americans as brave but undisciplined, courageous but amateurish, men who needed British supervision to function effectively. It was not cruelty but conviction. They genuinely believed themselves the senior partners in a grand alliance of necessity. The voice of that belief was Bernard Montgomery. Meticulous, confident, and utterly convinced of his own methods, Montgomery had rebuilt the British Eighth Army after years of defeat. His victory at El Alamein had transformed him into a national hero, a symbol of British endurance. To his troops, he was the general who valued their lives, who planned every attack with precision. To the Americans, arriving fresh from their baptism of fire, he was a man who carried himself like the keeper of civilization itself. The first test of this uneasy partnership came as the Allies prepared to crush the Axis in Tunisia. General Harold Alexander commanded the joint force, and his orders revealed the quiet hierarchy that shaped every Allied decision. Montgomery and the Eighth Army would deliver the main blow. The Americans under Patton would play the supporting role. The logic was sound on paper. Montgomery's troops were seasoned, Patton's still learning, but the implications cut deep. Once again, the British would lead, and the Americans would protect their flank. Patton, fiery and proud, saw what was happening. The British were already writing the story of victory, and the Americans were destined to appear only in the footnotes. Determined to change the script, he threw his men into battle with a fury that bordered on reckless faith. At El Gheta, the 10th Panzer Division rolled forward in the early dawn, confident they faced another easy rout. What they found instead was an American army reborn. Patton's artillery opened like thunder, shells blanketing the valley, tanks manoeuvring with precision that shocked the German commanders. By nightfall, the desert floor was littered with burning armour. The Americans had held. For the first time, they had stopped the Wehrmacht cold. Yet, as dispatches travelled north to British headquarters, the triumph seemed to fade in translation. Reports spoke of useful American assistance, as if victory had been a matter of British guidance, and not American grit. Patton noticed. Every American officer did. They were beginning to understand that in coalition warfare, winning the battle was not enough. You had to fight for the narrative too. When Tunisia finally fell in May 1943, the parades in Tunis celebrated Allied unity, but the banners told another story. Montgomery was the hero of El Alamein, Alexander the architect of victory. American achievements were buried beneath British diplomacy and self-promotion. The lesson stuck, hard and bitter. The Americans had proven themselves in the field, but they were still treated as the students of British masters. The tension between the old world and the new was no longer theoretical. It was alive inside every command tent, every operation order, every briefing. That tension would explode 2 months later on the shores of Sicily. Operation Husky, the invasion of Europe's gateway, was meant to showcase Allied cooperation. Instead, it revealed its fractures in full daylight. The plan had been controversial. From the start, air commanders argued for dispersed landings to neutralize Axis airfields. Naval leaders worried about crowded waters. Montgomery, ever the strategist, dismissed their concerns with characteristic certainty. The landings, he insisted, must be concentrated on Sicily's southeastern tip, where his Eighth Army would drive north toward Messina. The Americans would guard his flank, hold defensively, and support the main thrust, his thrust. When Eisenhower approved the plan, the message to the Americans was unmistakable. The British would lead, the Americans would follow. Patton's diary from the days before the landing seethed with restrained rage. He wrote that the British intended to claim all glory while leaving the Americans to the unglamorous work of security and supply. He would not allow it. On July 10th, 1943, as Allied ships loomed through the pre-dawn haze, Patton's men stormed ashore under fire, chaos all around. Gliders crashed into the sea, paratroopers scattered in the dark, but by sunrise, American divisions had carved out a beachhead and held it against fierce counterattacks. At Gela, German tanks broke through the surf, their treads biting sand. American infantry and naval guns stopped them at point-blank range. Montgomery, advancing on the eastern coast, met tougher opposition near Catania and found progress slow, grinding, bloody. He called for reinforcements, demanded fuel and ammunition, and eventually requested, no, instructed, that the Americans shift their lines westward to widen his front. In effect, he was ordering Patton to halt his advance and let the British take over the road to Messina. Alexander, deferential as always to the British hero, approved. To the Americans, it was the same humiliation dressed in new orders. Patton obeyed, officially. But privately he resolved to turn the supporting role into a race. If Montgomery wanted Messina, he would have to get there first. Within days, 7th Army surged forward. Across mountain passes and shattered roads, American troops advanced with relentless momentum. Town after town fell. Palermo was taken on July 22nd, a prize Montgomery had not even considered within American reach. The newspapers back home erupted in celebration, and Patton, smiling behind his sunglasses, had what he wanted. Proof that American command was equal to any in the world. Yet even in triumph, the bitterness remained. Montgomery's reports to London downplayed the significance of the American advance, framing it as convenient, even fortunate, but strategically secondary. The British press echoed his tone. When both armies reached Messina in mid-August, American troops entered the city first, but British reporters described it as a shared success. Patton had won the race, but Montgomery would not concede the narrative. Beneath the public smiles, Allied unity was cracking. What had begun in the sands of North Africa as rivalry was becoming something deeper, a battle of pride between empires, waged not only with bullets and tanks but with words, reputation, and ego. And though the Americans were winning the war, they were discovering something unsettling. Their greatest obstacle was not the German army, but the arrogance of their ally. September 1944. France was free, the German army broken, and Allied flags rippled in the wind over liberated cities. Yet behind the triumph, an invisible storm brewed. Bernard Montgomery, now elevated to Field Marshal, basked in the glow of his Normandy triumph. To the British press, he was the architect of D-Day, the mind that had cracked the Atlantic Wall. To his American counterparts, he was becoming intolerable, a man whose brilliance was matched only by his ability to alienate everyone around him. Dwight Eisenhower, calm and diplomatic, had taken over direct command of all Allied ground forces at the start of September. Montgomery, who had commanded during the invasion, was quietly moved to lead only the British and Canadian armies under the 21st Army Group. On paper, it was an administrative shift. In reality, it was the beginning of a Cold War within the alliance itself. Montgomery chafed at the new structure. He believed in a single decisive thrust, a concentrated hammer blow across the Rhine that would carry British troops straight into Germany's industrial heartland. It was a bold plan, audacious, elegant, and perfectly designed to place him at the centre of history once again. Eisenhower, however, favoured a broad front advance, every army pushing forward together, slowly, relentlessly, ensuring that no flank was left exposed. It was the difference between the gambler and the engineer, and Montgomery, who viewed himself as the only professional soldier among diplomats, could not tolerate it. He argued, cajoled, and demanded resources that other commanders needed just as desperately. In his messages to London, He complained that Eisenhower's leadership lacked vision. In private conversations, he implied that if the Americans would simply let him run the war, it could be over by Christmas. The Field Marshal's confidence was unshakable. The problem was he might actually have believed it. His plan, soon named Operation Market Garden, was a hybrid of daring and delusion. The concept was simple. 3 airborne divisions, 2 American, 1 British, would parachute into the Netherlands to seize a chain of bridges leading across the Rhine. Once secured, Montgomery's ground forces would charge up a single highway, link up with the paratroopers, and thrust into Germany before the enemy could react. It was meant to be the war's final masterstroke, a lightning victory that would restore British primacy and prove once more that Montgomery was the indispensable man. The Americans were sceptical from the start. Omar Bradley doubted the logistics. George Patton called it Monty's airborne madness. Even Eisenhower hesitated before finally yielding to political reality. The British public adored Montgomery. Churchill trusted him. Denying him would fracture the alliance. Approving the plan might only fracture the front. On September 17, 1944, Operation Market Garden began. The skies above Holland filled with aircraft, gliders and parachutes, a ballet of men and machines stretching from horizon to horizon. On the ground, British tanks of XXX Corps rolled north along a narrow highway, the Hell's Highway, racing to reach the airborne troops before the Germans could react. For the first 24 hours, everything went according to plan. Then reality, grim and familiar, intervened. The airborne landings had scattered. Intelligence warnings about German armour near Arnhem had been ignored. Paratroopers dropped too far from their objectives, fighting desperately to reach the bridges they were supposed to hold. The British paratroopers at Arnhem, led by the indomitable Colonel John Frost, seized the bridge and held it for days, surrounded, isolated, outnumbered. They waited for Montgomery's relief column that never came. The highway turned into a choke point of wrecked tanks and burning vehicles. German counterattacks smashed into the British advance, cutting it apart piece by piece. By the time the operation was called off, more than 17,000 Allied soldiers were dead, wounded or captured. The Rhine remained firmly in German hands. The plan had failed. For the Americans, the aftermath was predictable and infuriating. Rather than admit defeat, Montgomery held a press conference declaring the mission 90% successful. He pointed to the bridges that had been taken, the ground that had been gained, and the courage of his men. The rest, he implied, was a matter of luck, and of support he had not received. In the offices of Bradley and Patton, silence turned to fury. They had seen enough of Montgomery's pattern to recognize it instantly. When he won, it was genius. When he lost, it was logistics. When someone else succeeded, it was because they followed his example. Eisenhower, exhausted by months of managing egos as much as armies, refused to confront him directly, but privately his patience was eroding. Monty is a good man to have in a crisis, he admitted, but God save us from his victory speeches. The irony was that Montgomery's methods, the caution, the precision, the insistence on overwhelming force, had made him one of the most successful British generals in history. He rarely lost. But in coalition warfare, where diplomacy was as vital as tactics, victory demanded humility as much as strategy. And that was one resource Montgomery had never learned to ration. As autumn deepened, German resistance stiffened. The grand advance stalled. Patton's Third Army, starved of fuel diverted to Montgomery's operation, clawed its way east through mud and rain, cursing that damn Englishman in every report. By December, the front lines stretched thin across Belgium and the Ardennes, a region of dense forests the Allies believed impassable to tanks. They were wrong. On December 16th, Hitler launched his final counteroffensive, striking through the Ardennes in a surprise attack that would become the Battle of the Bulge. The German assault tore through American lines, splitting divisions, capturing towns, driving deep into Belgium. For the first time since Normandy, Eisenhower's command teetered on the edge of disaster. In the chaos, 2 American armies, Bradley's 1st and 9th, became separated from his headquarters. To restore order, Eisenhower made a controversial choice. He placed both armies under Montgomery's temporary control. It was a practical decision, not a political one, but to the Americans who had fought beside him, it felt like the ultimate insult. Montgomery took charge with his usual efficiency. He imposed discipline, reorganized the defences, and coordinated the counteroffensive that would eventually turn the tide. His leadership during those critical weeks was undeniably effective, but when the battle was won, his old habits returned with vengeance. On January 7th, 1945, Montgomery stepped before reporters in Brussels. The battle, he declared, had been one of the most interesting of his career. He praised American courage, then calmly described how he, Montgomery, had personally stabilized the front, anticipated the enemy's moves, and tidied up the battlefield. The implication was unmistakable. The Americans had fought bravely but needed British genius to save them. The press loved it. His fellow commanders did not. Patton raged. Bradley threatened to resign. Eisenhower drafted a cable to London, warning that if Montgomery did not publicly retract his remarks, he would request his removal. It took the combined pressure of Churchill, Alan Brooke, and the British War Office to force Montgomery to issue an apology. The words came, but the damage was done. From that day forward, Montgomery was tolerated, never trusted. The Americans had finally learned what the British already knew, that Monty could win battles, but he could not win friends, and for a coalition fighting the largest war in human history, that flaw was almost fatal. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Allies stood victorious, but the bonds that had carried them through the war were frayed to the breaking point. Bernard Law Montgomery, once hailed as Britain's greatest commander since Wellington, emerged from the ashes both celebrated and condemned. To the public he remained the hero of El Alamein, the soldier who never lost a major battle, the guardian of British pride in a war increasingly defined by American power. But to the American generals who had fought beside him, he symbolized something else entirely, the peril of ego in an alliance built on uneasy equality. The uneasy truth was that Montgomery had won his wars, but lost his allies. Eisenhower, who had mastered the art of diplomacy under impossible conditions, maintained the appearance of civility, but the warmth between them had long evaporated. Bradley, the steady and loyal partner of America's great campaigns, would never again utter Montgomery's name without a shadow of contempt. Patton, fiery and unfiltered as ever, saw him as the embodiment of everything America had rebelled against in 1776, a monarch in khaki, ruling by arrogance instead of merit. Yet Montgomery's story was not one of simple villainy. It was a tragedy written in discipline and pride, where virtues turned inward and became flaws. He was methodical because he feared chaos, cautious because he understood the price of reckless glory, proud because Britain, exhausted and diminished, needed a hero to remind it of who it once was. In the early months of peace he returned home to adulation. Parades filled London streets, and the people who had endured bombings and rationing lined up to see the man who had delivered their salvation. Churchill, ever the showman, praised him as the indomitable soldier of the empire, but history was already shifting beneath his feet. The United States had emerged from the war not merely as an ally, but as the new superpower, the engine of the free world, its economy and military strength unmatched. Britain, bled white by years of conflict, now stood in the shadow of the partner it had once led. And for Montgomery, who had never been able to imagine himself as anything but first among equals, that reality was intolerable. His post-war career reflected the contradictions of his character. As chief of the Imperial General Staff, he attempted to impose the same precision and rigidity on peacetime administration that had defined his battlefield command. Officers admired his intellect but chafed under his inflexibility. Diplomats found him impossible to manage. American generals, now partners in shaping NATO, endured him out of respect, not affection. His public statements, still laced with the conviction that he alone understood the art of war, kept reigniting old resentments. He lectured American audiences on discipline, planning and leadership, warning them that victory had made them careless. To the men who had crossed Europe under his criticism, it felt like salt poured into an old wound. Eisenhower, now President of the United States, maintained silence in public but refused to see him again in private. Bradley, when asked years later what he thought of Montgomery, answered simply, "He was a good soldier, but a poor ally." The judgment was cruel, but it carried the weight of truth. Montgomery's genius had been real. His soldiers had loved him. His meticulous preparation had saved lives. But in the crucible of coalition warfare, leadership required not just intellect, but empathy. a quality Montgomery regarded as weakness. He could inspire but not cooperate. He could command but not share command. And in a war fought by nations as much as armies, that flaw was fatal. As historians sifted through the records, the arguments began. British writers painted him as the saviour of an overstretched empire, a man who turned near disaster into triumph through sheer will. American historians countered that he was a master of self-promotion, a tactician who mistook caution for genius and mistook allies for subordinates. The debate grew louder with each passing decade, fueled by memoirs and documentaries, by soldiers' recollections and the endless clash of national pride. Yet beneath the arguments lay a truth too often ignored. Both sides were right. Montgomery had been brilliant. He had also been impossible. His victories, El Alamein, Normandy, the defence of the Meuse, were real. His failures, Market Garden, the fracture of Allied unity, were equally undeniable. He was not a caricature, not a villain, but a man who embodied the contradictions of his time: genius without grace, courage without humility, success without peace. The bitterness he left behind would outlast him by generations. In 1958, when he published his memoirs, he reopened every wound he had ever inflicted. He criticised Eisenhower's leadership, questioned Bradley's competence, dismissed Patton's aggression, and portrayed himself as the only clear-eyed strategist in a sea of mediocrity. The reaction was swift and merciless. American veterans denounced him. British officers distanced themselves. Even Churchill, the man who had once defended him at every turn, called the book ill-advised. Montgomery seemed unfazed. He wrote as he had always fought, with supreme confidence, certain that history would vindicate him. But history, like war, does not obey a single commander. By the time of his death in 1976, the world had changed beyond recognition. The empire he had served was gone. The American alliance he had strained now guarded Europe from a new enemy in the east. The age of the great field marshals was over. Yet the legend of Monty endured, on parade grounds, in classrooms, in the hearts of soldiers who studied his battles and argued his legacy. For the British, he remained the last great general of a fading empire. For the Americans, he was the necessary lesson in the perils of partnership without respect. Every future coalition, Korea, the Gulf, Afghanistan, would quietly bear his shadow. Modern commanders learned what Eisenhower had learned the hard way, that unity cannot survive ego, and that leadership without humility leads only to division. And so the verdict on Bernard Montgomery became not one of condemnation, but of balance. He was the right man for Britain's darkest hour, and the wrong man for its greatest alliance. He could win any battle but never the room. He could inspire soldiers but alienate generals. He could see the field clearly but never his own reflection. In war he was magnificent. In peace he was unbearable. The Americans never truly hated him because he was British. They hated him because he made them feel like colonials in their own war. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. The man who fought for unity among nations became the symbol of its fragility. History remembers him not for the friends he made, but for the lessons he left behind. That pride can undo partnership, and that even the brightest victories can cast the longest shadows. In the end, Montgomery stood alone, as he had always stood, uncompromising, brilliant, and certain of his own righteousness. His armies had vanished into history, his empire into memory, but his name endures, not as an anthem of glory, but as a warning whispered across the decades. Genius wins battles, but humility wins wars.